My parents declared me dead. 12 years of silence. But when I hit Fortune 500, Mom suddenly texted, "My name is Marcus Terrell Washington." And for 12 years, my parents told everyone I was dead. Not missing, not estranged, not living somewhere else doing my own thing. They told our church congregation, our extended family scattered across 3 states, and every member of the Greater Atlanta Black Professional Network that I had died tragically at 21. They held a repast at Pascal's restaurant with fried chicken and mac and cheese paid for by sympathetic donations. They accepted condolence cards that still arrive at their house even now, yellowed with age and filled with scripture verses about God calling home his angels. They wore black armbands to Sunday service for 6 months, sitting in the front pew where everyone could see their grief. Hello friends, before I continue the story, please support the channel by becoming a subscriber and giving the video a like. Also, let us know in the comments where you're watching right now. I discovered my own death 4 years after it happened through a LinkedIn message from my college roommate, Jerome, who I hadn't spoken to since I dropped out. It was a scanned image of the funeral program, my freshman year ID photo printed on cream-colored cardstock with gold embossed letters spelling out, "In loving memory of Marcus T. Washington." I was 25 then, sleeping on an air mattress in a converted storage unit in East Palo Alto, teaching myself Java and Python through YouTube videos on a refurbished ThinkPad I'd bought for $80 at a pawn shop. I remember sitting on the floor of that suffocating little room, the California heat making it hard to breathe, staring at that image until the screen went dark. That was the moment something inside me calcified into stone, something that had been soft and hoping for reconciliation. That was the day I stopped being their son and became something else entirely, something harder, something built for survival. 12 years have passed since the night my father, Reverend Augustus Washington, threw my duffel bag onto the lawn of our Cascade Heights home and told me I was a disgrace to 3 generations of Washington men. 12 years of absolute radio silence, no calls, no letters, no accidental run-ins at family reunions I was never invited to. Today I stood in my corner office on the 55th floor of the Bank of America Plaza in downtown Atlanta, the tallest building in the city, looking out over the sprawling metropolitan landscape that stretched to the horizon. The view usually centers me, reminds me how far I've climbed from that storage unit with no air conditioning and dreams that seemed impossibly distant. But today the view did nothing to calm the storm building in my chest. My phone sat on the minimalist walnut desk, a custom-built piece that cost more than my first car, more than my first 3 cars combined. It had vibrated exactly once at 9:47 a.m., a single buzz that felt like an earthquake rearranging the tectonic plates of my carefully constructed life. I looked down at the screen and saw the notification still glowing there, demanding attention I didn't want to give. The number wasn't saved under a name, but I knew exactly who it was because I had memorized those 10 digits long before I ever thought about blocking them. The text message was brief, clinical, stripped of any emotion or acknowledgement of the chasm of years between us. "Marcus, it's your mother. We need to talk. Family emergency. Please call as soon as possible. No, how have you been? No, I saw your name in the news. No, I'm sorry we held a funeral for you while you were alive and struggling to survive." Just a command disguised as a request. The same tone she used when I was 16 and she needed me to pick up my younger sister from dance practice. I didn't respond immediately because my hands were shaking and I needed them steady for what was coming next. I walked across the office to the floor-to-ceiling windows and pressed my forehead against the cool glass. My reflection stared back at me, and I barely recognized the man I'd become over these 12 years of exile and ambition. I was 33 years old now, no longer the skinny kid with cornrows and a backpack full of computer science textbooks he couldn't afford. I was the founder and CEO of Meridian Systems, a cybersecurity firm that protected the digital infrastructure of Fortune 100 companies, major hospitals, and 3 different branches of the federal government. This morning at 6 a.m. Eastern Time, CNBC had announced that Meridian was being acquired by a Silicon Valley giant for $2.7 billion, with me retaining a leadership position and a payout that would put my net worth somewhere north of $800 million. My face had been on Bloomberg, on CNN Money, on the cover of Black Enterprise with the headline, "From Dropout to Billionaire. The Marcus Washington Story." That was the trigger. The only reason my phone had buzzed with a message from a woman who hadn't spoken to me since I was 21 years old. The door to my office opened without a knock, which meant it could only be one person. Cameron Brooks walked in, my attorney, my strategist, my closest friend, and the only person in the world who knew the full extent of what I was about to do. He was 42, a Howard Law graduate who wore three-piece suits like armor and had eyes that could read a contract for traps the way a sniper reads wind patterns. He carried a black leather portfolio embossed with his firm's name in gold letters, and his expression was the calm, focused look of a man preparing for war. "It's time, Marcus," he said quietly, his deep voice carrying the weight of months of preparation. The wire transfers cleared at 9:15 this morning. Vanguard Equity Partners now holds the paper on everything: the primary mortgage, the business loans, the second lien on the property, even the personal credit lines. I turned away from the window and looked at the portfolio he placed on my desk, the physical manifestation of 12 years of rage compressed into financial instruments and legal documents. "Did you get confirmation from the bank about the other matter?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Cameron nodded, opening the portfolio to reveal a stack of documents organized with colored tabs, each one representing a different weapon in the arsenal we'd assembled. "Chase confirmed it this morning," he said, running his finger down a spreadsheet. "The ministry expansion loan, the operational line of credit, the vehicle leases, the building mortgage, all of it. You own every dollar of debt attached to New Testament Holiness Ministry. You own your father's church, Marcus." I sat down in my chair and ran my hand over the leather of the portfolio, feeling the weight of what we'd done. For 18 months, we'd quietly purchased every piece of debt my parents had accumulated, using shell companies and intermediaries so they'd never know who was tightening the noose. "Are you absolutely certain you want to do this face to face?" Cameron asked, studying me with the careful attention of someone who'd seen me at my lowest and my highest. "We can execute everything remotely. We can have process servers deliver the notices tomorrow morning. You don't have to see them, Marcus." I looked at the scar on my left hand, a thin white line from where I'd cut myself on a chain link fence the night I left home, jumping it because my father had locked the gate. "No," I said firmly, shaking my head. "Mailing documents is business. This isn't business, Cameron. This is biblical. They need to see what resurrection looks like when it comes with receipts." I picked up my phone and typed 3 words in response to my mother's text: "I'm coming home." The confirmation of my arrival would send ripples through whatever carefully constructed narrative they'd been living in, and I wanted them to feel every single wave. I packed for the confrontation the way a general packs for battle, with precision and purpose. My overnight bag contained a Tom Ford suit in midnight blue, custom-tailored to fit my frame perfectly, a suit that cost $7,000 and announced success before I ever opened my mouth. I packed a pair of platinum cufflinks I'd bought myself after my first major government contract, engraved with the coordinates of that storage unit in East Palo Alto where I'd lived on ramen and determination. And in the zippered inner pocket of my leather messenger bag, I carried the only thing I'd kept from my old life: a photograph of my grandmother, Big Mama Eleanor, who'd slipped me $200 the night I left and whispered, "Go build something they can't tear down, baby." As I zipped the bag closed, a memory crashed over me like a wave I couldn't dodge. It always happened when the seasons changed, when the air got that crisp quality that reminded me of the worst night of my life. November, 12 years ago. The foyer of our house had smelled like pine sol and the lingering aroma of Sunday dinner, fried catfish and collard greens. I had just told them I was leaving Morehouse College after 3 semesters because I couldn't afford the tuition, and I'd gotten an opportunity to join a startup in California that was doing revolutionary work in encryption technology. My father hadn't yelled because Reverend Augustus Washington never raised his voice. Raised voices were for people who'd lost control, and he never lost control. He had simply stood by the mantel in his study, still wearing his Sunday suit and pastoral collar, and looked at me with a disappointment so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. "If you walk out that door without finishing your degree," he had said, his voice quiet and absolute, "you are dead to this family, you are dead to this community, and you are dead to the legacy of Washington men who built something with education and dignity." I had tried to explain that the opportunity was real, that I could always finish school later, that this was my shot. But my mother, First Lady Diane Washington, had stood beside him in her church suit and hat, her arms crossed, and said the words that still echoed in my nightmares. "You are destroying everything we built, Marcus," she'd said, her voice cold and clinical. 3 generations of respect, of standing, of being somebody in this city. You're throwing it away to play with computers like some kind of dropout failure. We will not watch you disgrace us. When I reached for the door handle, my father delivered the killing blow with the precision of a man who'd delivered 1,000 sermons about consequences. "Don't bother coming back," he said. "Don't call here. Don't write. As far as the Washington family is concerned, Marcus Terrell Washington died today." I thought it was hyperbole, the kind of dramatic statement parents make when they're angry and hurt. I didn't know they would actually tell people I was dead, that they'd create an entire fiction about a car accident in California, a closed casket service, a grave marker in a cemetery where nothing was buried but their lies. I found out later through cousins who eventually tracked me down that they'd told everyone I'd gotten mixed up with drugs out west, that I died from an overdose after losing my way. It was a perfect story, tragic enough to generate sympathy, shameful enough to explain why they never talked about the details, and final enough that no one would ask questions when I never appeared at family gatherings. They got to maintain their reputation as grieving parents while erasing the inconvenient truth that their son had chosen his own path. Sitting on the edge of my bed in my Buckhead penthouse, I forced myself to breathe slowly, a technique I'd learned from the therapist I'd been seeing for 6 years. In through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 4. I wasn't that terrified 21-year-old anymore, sleeping in his car at rest stops between Atlanta and California, wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. I stood up and walked to the full-length mirror in my bedroom, looking at the man I'd become through sheer will and endless work. The man staring back had close-cropped hair with the first hints of gray at the temples, a tailored suit that fit like it was painted on, and eyes that had seen the bottom and climbed all the way to the top. I wasn't going home to beg for acceptance or to show off my wealth like some kind of lottery winner. I was going home to settle accounts, to collect on a debt that had been accruing interest for 12 years. "Ready?" Cameron asked from the doorway of my bedroom, checking his watch. "The car is downstairs and traffic on 85 is light. We can make it to Cascade in 20 minutes. I picked up the leather portfolio containing all the documentation of their financial collapse. Every loan, every lien, every dollar they owed and couldn't pay. "Let's go," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I don't want to be late to my own resurrection." The Mercedes Maybach S680 waited at the curb, its black paint so deep and perfect it looked like liquid night. The interior was cream leather and burled walnut, a stark contrast to the 1997 Honda Civic I'd driven across the country 12 years ago, the one that had finally died in Sacramento with smoke pouring from the engine and all my belongings in garbage bags in the back seat. That car had smelled like cheap air freshener and anxiety. This car smelled like success and expensive cologne. I sat in the back seat while Cameron drove, watching the city pass by through tinted windows that kept the world at a safe distance. We drove south through downtown, past the stadiums and the university, into the neighborhoods I'd grown up in. "Let's review the timeline one more time," Cameron said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. He was methodical, precise, the kind of lawyer who prepared for every contingency and built cases like brick houses. "Go ahead," I said, taking a sip of bottled water. I needed to stay sharp and focused. 2 years ago, Cameron began, we identified that New Testament holiness ministry was overleveraged. Your father had borrowed against the church property to fund the expansion project, the new sanctuary, the community center, the school building. The construction went over budget by 40%, and the congregation's giving didn't increase enough to cover the debt service. "Classic Augustus," I murmured, remembering my father's tendency toward grandiose vision without practical planning. "We set up Vanguard Equity Partners as a Delaware LLC," Cameron continued, "with no public connection to you or Meridian Systems. We approached their lenders quietly. First National Bank was getting nervous about the ministry's ability to pay, especially with declining membership and the economy tightening. They were happy to offload the risk to a private equity buyer. I watched the familiar streets roll past, churches and schools and corner stores I'd known my whole childhood. We acquired the primary mortgage on the church property 18 months ago, Cameron said, reading from his notes. We bought the equipment loans and the operational credit line 9 months ago. And last week, we purchased the personal debt, the home equity line, the car loans, your mother's credit cards. Everything. I looked at the spreadsheet Cameron handed me, row after row of numbers that told the story of my parents' financial collapse. They owed nearly $4 million across various loans and credit facilities, all of it now owned by a company that was ultimately me. They're technically insolvent, Cameron said, his voice matter of fact. They've been robbing Peter to pay Paul for at least 2 years. If we hadn't stepped in, the bank would have foreclosed by March anyway. We just took control of the process. And the fraud issue? I asked, knowing there was more to the story than just debt. Cameron tapped a specific document, his expression darkening. To secure the last construction loan, your father provided financial statements that materially overstated the church's revenue. He also failed to disclose the existing liens on the property. That's bank fraud, Marcus. Federal crime. If you wanted to pursue it, the U.S. attorney would be very interested. I looked out the window at a church we were passing, its steeple reaching toward gray Atlanta skies. I don't want him in prison, I said quietly, surprising myself with the truth of it. Prison would make him a martyr, someone persecuted for doing God's work. I want something else. What do you want? Cameron asked, genuinely curious. I thought about that question for a long moment, watching the neighborhoods get progressively more affluent as we approached Cascade Heights. I want him to stand in his pulpit, in front of his congregation, and tell the truth, I said. I want him to admit what he did. I want the people who mourned me to know I'm alive. I want him to feel what it's like when your reputation, the only thing you value, turns to ash. We turned onto the tree-lined street where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to ride a bike and played basketball in driveways and walked to school with kids I'd known since kindergarten. The houses here were substantial, brick colonials and sprawling ranches with manicured lawns and luxury cars in circular driveways. This was where Atlanta's black professional class had put down roots, doctors and lawyers and business owners and clergy. We pulled up to the house at 4247 Cascade Road, and I felt my chest tighten. It looked exactly the same, red brick, white columns, a perfectly maintained lawn even in late November. The circular driveway held 2 cars, my father's black Cadillac Escalade and my mother's silver Lexus sedan. Both were at least 6 years old, which was unusual for people who used to trade in their vehicles every 2 years like clockwork. They were holding on, maintaining appearances even as everything crumbled. I noticed something else. The paint on the shutters was peeling slightly, and one of the gutters was hanging loose, small signs of deferred maintenance that would have been unthinkable in the past. Ready? Cameron asked, putting the car in park. Give me a minute, I said. I stepped out of the car into the cold November air, the kind of cold that cuts through your coat and reminds you that winter is coming. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing, centering myself. Then I heard a voice. Oh my God! I turned. Mrs. Patterson from 3 doors down was getting her mail, wrapped in a thick cardigan against the cold. She was staring at me like I was an apparition, her mouth open, her hand frozen on her mailbox. She'd known me since I was in elementary school, had brought casseroles to our house when Big Mama Eleanor died. Marcus? She whispered, taking a step toward me, then stopping like she was afraid I might disappear. Marcus Washington? But they said you were dead. I finished for her, my voice calm and clear. I know what they said, Mrs. Patterson. They were wrong. Her hand flew to her chest, and I could see her mind working, trying to reconcile what she'd been told with what she was seeing. But the funeral, the program, your mother was devastated for months. Was she? I asked, and I couldn't keep the edge out of my voice. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like she's been just fine. Mrs. Patterson took another step back, her expression shifting from shock to confusion to something that might have been anger. She looked at the house, then back at me, and I could see her reassembling the narrative, understanding dawning. They lied, she said, her voice barely audible. All this time they lied. Yes, ma'am, I said. They did. I watched as she turned and walked quickly back to her house, pulling out her phone before she even reached her front door. Good. By tomorrow, everyone in Cascade Heights would know that Marcus Washington had risen from the dead. That was intentional, Cameron observed as he came to stand beside me, closing the car door. That was necessary, I replied. They built their reputation on a lie. I'm just here to tell the truth. I straightened my tie, checked my reflection in the car window one last time, and turned toward the house. The walkway was lined with perfectly trimmed boxwoods, and the front porch held 2 rocking chairs my parents never sat in, decorative pieces meant to project an image of domestic tranquility. I walked up the steps, my Italian leather shoes clicking on the stone, and stood before the door I'd walked out of 12 years ago. I reached out and pressed the doorbell. The sound echoed inside, the same 4-note chime I'd heard 10,000 times growing up. I waited, my heart steady, my mind clear. This was it, the moment I'd been building toward for 12 years of grinding work and deferred satisfaction. I wasn't the wolf at the door. I was something far more dangerous. I was the truth, and I was about to tear down a house built on lies. The door opened, and there stood my mother, First Lady Diane Washington. She was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that I recognized from at least 3 years ago, altered to fit her frame that had gotten thinner, more angular. Her hair was still perfectly styled, pressed and curled in the way she'd always maintained, but I could see more gray than she used to allow. Her makeup was flawless, applied with the precision of someone who understood that presentation was armor. For 5 full seconds, she just stared at me, her eyes moving from my face to my suit to the car parked in the driveway. I saw the calculations happening in real time, saw her trying to figure out what version of me she was dealing with, what she could use, what she could manipulate. Marcus, she finally said, and her voice cracked on my name. Then she did something I didn't expect. She lunged forward and wrapped her arms around me in a hug that felt practiced and performative. The smell hit me immediately. Chanel No. 5 and the faint scent of the shea butter she used. A smell that triggered 1,000 memories I'd worked hard to suppress. I stood completely still, my arms at my sides, not returning the embrace. It was like hugging a statue, and after a few seconds, she seemed to realize I wasn't reciprocating. She pulled back, her smile faltering for just a moment before she reconstructed it. "Look at you," she said, her hands hovering near my shoulders but not quite touching. "You look so successful." "Doesn't he look successful, Augustus?" My father appeared in the hallway behind her, emerging from his study like a judge taking the bench. Reverend Augustus Washington was 68 years old, still tall and imposing in a cardigan and slacks, but something had diminished in him. His shoulders weren't quite as straight, his face was more drawn, and his eyes held a weariness I'd never seen before. He didn't smile, didn't cry, didn't show any emotion except a kind of cautious assessment. "You're late," he said, his voice still carrying that resonant preacher quality. "We expected you an hour ago." 12 years of silence, 12 years of being declared dead and erased, and his first words to me were a criticism of my timing. Some things apparently never changed. "Traffic," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. "Hello, Reverend Washington." I watched him flinch at the formal address, at the use of his title instead of Dad or Father or any of the names I'd called him before. "And who is this?" my father asked, looking past me to where Cameron stood on the porch, briefcase in hand. "This is Cameron Brooks," I said. "My attorney." "We said family only," my father said, his jaw tightening. "Cameron is family," I replied smoothly. "He knows more about me than anyone in this house ever did." My mother stepped aside, gesturing us into the foyer with a kind of manic hospitality. "Please come in, come in. We have so much to catch up on." I stepped across the threshold, and it felt like crossing the river Styx. The house was exactly as I remembered it, the marble floors, the curved staircase, the formal living room to the left. But like my parents, everything had a slightly worn quality, a sense of things being maintained but not renewed. I looked at the walls, which had always been covered with family photos in expensive frames. There were pictures of my younger sister Alicia at her college graduation, pictures of my parents with various dignitaries and church leaders, pictures from mission trips and conferences. There was not a single photograph of me anywhere. Not one. It was as if I had never existed, as if those first 21 years of my life had been completely erased. They had literally removed me from the family narrative. "Come, sit down," my mother said, leading us toward the living room. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Tea? Your father just picked up some of those honey buns you used to love from the bakery." The casual domesticity of the offer, as if I'd just been away at college for a semester, made rage spike hot in my chest. "I'm fine," I said curtly. "Let's get to business." The living room was formal and cold, decorated in creams and golds that had been fashionable 15 years ago. I sat on one sofa, Cameron beside me, and my parents sat across from us on the matching couch. The coffee table between us felt like a demilitarized zone. "So," my father began, settling into the practiced cadence of someone used to controlling conversations. "We saw the news about your company. Quite an accomplishment. God has blessed you." The casual invocation of God's blessing, as if my success had anything to do with divine favor and nothing to do with 12 years of 18-hour days and survival mode hustle, almost made me laugh. "God had nothing to do with it," I said flatly. "I built Meridian from nothing with my own hands, Reverend." "We always knew you were smart," my mother chimed in, leaning forward with an eagerness that made my skin crawl. "Even when you were little, you were always tinkering with computers. Remember when you fixed the church's website when you were only 15? I stared at her. She was attempting to reconstruct a history of support that had never existed, painting herself as a mother who had encouraged my interests when the truth was she'd seen my love of technology as a distraction from the serious work of joining the family ministry or becoming a doctor or lawyer. "I remember you unplugging the router when I was working on a programming project because you needed me to drive you to a church function," I said, watching her smile freeze. My father cleared his throat, sensing the conversation wasn't going the direction he wanted. He shifted into negotiation mode, a skill honed through decades of dealing with church boards and building committees. "Marcus, we asked you here because we need to discuss something important," he said, his hands clasped in front of him. "The ministry is going through a transitional period, a temporary financial difficulty. The banks have been unreasonable, unwilling to work with us despite our decades of good standing in the community." "How much?" I asked. I wanted to hear him say the number, wanted to watch him minimize and justify. "It's not about a specific amount," my mother interjected. "It's about partnership. You're so successful now, and we hoped that you might want to invest in the ministry in your father's legacy." "Our legacy," my father corrected. "The Washington family legacy. For generations of ministry, of building up the community, of—" "How much do you owe?" I interrupted, cutting through the performance. My father's jaw tightened at being interrupted, but he was desperate enough to swallow his pride. "We need approximately $3 million to restructure our obligations and complete the construction project," he said, the words coming out like he was pulling teeth. $3 million would allow us to—" "You need $4.2 million, I corrected, watching both of them go still. $3.9 in secured debt on the church property and facilities, and another $300,000 in personal debt, credit cards, car loans, the home equity line you took out 2 years ago." The color drained from my mother's face. My father sat forward, his eyes narrowing with suspicion and anger. "How do you know that?" he demanded, his voice losing its pastoral gentleness and taking on a harder edge. "Because I know who owns your debt," I said calmly. I looked at Cameron, who had been sitting quietly, waiting for this moment. "Show them." Cameron opened his briefcase with the slow precision of a surgeon selecting instruments. He pulled out the portfolio and placed it on the coffee table with a solid thunk that seemed to echo in the silent room. He opened it to reveal the documents inside, organized with color-coded tabs. "Loan number 8847, Cameron read in his professional attorney voice, "originated with First National Bank, secured by the church property at 2891 Campbellton Road, principal balance of $2.1 million. Acquired by Vanguard Equity Partners on March 15th. He slid the document across the table. My father picked it up with shaking hands, staring at the assignment of debt. Construction loan 3392, Cameron continued, originated with SunTrust Bank, secured by equipment and facilities, principal balance of $1.3 million. Acquired by Vanguard Equity Partners on June 22nd. Another document slid across the table. Home equity line of credit, Cameron said, his voice taking on an edge. Secured by this property at 4247 Cascade Road. Balance of $475,000. Acquired by Vanguard Equity Partners on October 8th. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at the papers, then at my father, then at me, her eyes wide with dawning horror. Vanguard Equity Partners, my father said slowly, his mind working through the implications. Who are they? The bank said they were a legitimate investment firm, that we'd have time to. They are legitimate, I said. Very legitimate. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the manicured lawn I used to mow every Saturday. Then I turned back to face my parents, and I let them see the truth in my eyes. I am Vanguard Equity Partners. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that exists in the moment before a bomb explodes, before a building collapses, before a life ends. My mother made a sound like a wounded animal, a high-pitched keen that she tried to stifle with her hand. My father sat frozen, the document still in his hands, his face cycling through shock, disbelief, and rage. You, he finally whispered, you bought our debt? All of it? I confirmed, my voice steady and cold. Every single dollar you owe. I own the church property, Reverend. I own this house. I own your cars. I own everything you've spent 4 decades building. My mother stood up abruptly, her carefully constructed composure shattering. You can't. We're your parents, Marcus. You can't do this to us. Can't I? I asked, tilting my head slightly. I'm just a businessman who acquired distressed assets. This is capitalism, Mother. I thought you believed in the American dream. My father stood up slowly, and I could see him trying to marshal his dignity, trying to find the authority he'd always wielded over me. This is ungodly, he said, his voice rising to the preacher volume he used from the pulpit. This is vindictive and cruel. We are your family. The Bible says a lot of things. I interrupted, my voice cutting through his sermon before it could start. It says, honor thy father and mother. But it also says, do not lie. It says, love thy neighbor. But it also says, reap what you sow. Which scripture should we follow here, Reverend? He took a step toward me, and for a moment I thought he might actually swing at me, might let his rage override his self-control. But he stopped, breathing hard, his fists clenched at his sides. You want to destroy us, he said. You want revenge because we didn't support your foolish decision to throw away your education. No, I said quietly, and I meant it. I don't want to destroy you. I want you to tell the truth. The truth? My mother said, her voice breaking. What truth? The truth that I'm not dead, I said, looking between them. The truth that you held a funeral for your living son because it was easier than admitting I had disappointed you. The truth that you cared more about your reputation than about my life. My father's face went pale, and I knew I'd hit the target. We did what we thought was best, he said, but his voice had lost its conviction. Best for who? I asked. Best for you? Best for the ministry? Because it sure as hell wasn't best for me. I walked back to the sofa and sat down. Suddenly tired, Cameron handed me a bottle of water from his briefcase, and I took a long drink, letting the silence stretch until my parents couldn't stand it anymore. What do you want from us? My father finally asked. What will it take for you to make this go away? I looked at him and saw what he'd become. A man who'd built his entire identity on being respected, being revered, being right. And now he was begging. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice calm and businesslike. Tomorrow is Sunday. You're going to stand in front of your congregation and tell them the truth. You're going to tell them that Marcus Washington is alive, that you lied about my death because you were ashamed that I left school and didn't follow your plan for my life. I can't do that, my father said immediately, shaking his head. The church, our reputation, people will. People will what? I asked. Think less of you? Judge you? Treat you like you're damaged? Welcome to what I lived through at 21 years old, Reverend. My mother was crying now, real tears streaming down her face, destroying her careful makeup. Marcus, please. There has to be another way. We can pay you back. We can set up a payment plan. Your father has connections, we can. With what? I asked. You're broke. You're $4 million in debt and the church membership is declining. You can't pay me back because you have nothing to pay me with. I pulled another document from Cameron's briefcase. A single sheet of paper with terms typed in clean, legal language. I'm willing to make you an offer, I said, placing the paper on the coffee table. You sign over the deed to the church property and this house to a nonprofit foundation I'm establishing. The foundation will lease the space back to the ministry for $1 a year, and you can continue running the church. Your personal debts will be forgiven completely. I watched hope flicker in their eyes before I delivered the rest. In exchange, you will stand before your congregation tomorrow and tell them the truth about what you did. You will issue a written apology to be published in the Church Bulletin and the Atlanta Daily World. And you will call every member of our extended family and everyone you told about my death, and you will correct the record. The hope died. My father's face went hard. That's public humiliation, he said. That's accountability, I countered. You humiliated me, Reverend. You erased me. You mourned a fiction and buried your living son's reputation. This is you making it right. And if we refuse? My mother asked, her voice small. Cameron spoke for the first time since reading the debt documents, his lawyer voice crisp and clear. If you refuse, we proceed with foreclosure. The church property will be seized and sold at auction. This house will be seized and sold at auction. Your personal assets will be liquidated. You'll be evicted within 30 days. And, he paused, making sure they were listening. We'll refer the fraudulent financial statements Reverend Washington provided to secure the last loan to the U.S. Attorney's Office for prosecution. My father collapsed back onto the sofa like his strings had been cut. Prison, he whispered. You'd send your own father to prison? You'd tell the world your own son was dead? I replied. We're both capable of difficult choices, it seems. The grandfather clock in the corner, a gift from my father's congregation on his 30th anniversary in ministry, ticked loudly in the silence. 5 seconds. 10. 15. I need time to think, my father said finally. You have until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, I said, standing up. Service starts at 11. That gives you an hour to decide if you're going to tell the truth or lose everything. I buttoned my suit jacket and picked up my phone. Cameron gathered the documents and closed his briefcase. My mother stood up, reaching toward me with trembling hands. Marcus, please, don't leave like this. Stay. Let's have dinner. Let's talk like a family. We're not a family, I said, the words coming out harder than I intended. Family doesn't erase each other. Family doesn't choose reputation over relationship. You made your choice 12 years ago, and I made mine. I walked toward the door, and my father's voice stopped me. You've become cold, he said. Hard. This success has turned you into someone I don't recognize. I turned back and looked at him, really looked at him. You never knew who I was to begin with, I said. You only knew who you wanted me to be. And when I couldn't be that person, you killed me rather than let me be myself. I opened the front door and stepped out into the November cold. Cameron followed, and we walked to the car without looking back. As we pulled away from the curb, I saw my mother standing in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, watching us leave. We drove in silence for several minutes before Cameron spoke. That was brutal, he said quietly. It was necessary, I replied, staring out the window at the passing houses and churches. Do you think they'll do it? He asked. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me hopes they will, hopes that somewhere inside them is the capacity to choose truth over image. But another part of me, I trailed off. Another part of you expects them to choose their reputation, Cameron finished. Like they always have. Yeah, I said. We drove to my penthouse in Buckhead, and I spent the night staring at the Atlanta skyline, wondering if I'd done the right thing, or if I'd just become the villain in someone else's story. The next morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of November Sunday that makes you want to stay in bed. I was up at 5 a.m., unable to sleep, running through scenarios in my mind. At 9:47 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Alicia. I don't know what's happening, but Dad is in his study crying. Mom won't stop praying. Please tell me you're alive. Please tell me this is real." My sister. I hadn't spoken to her in 12 years either, though she'd only been 13 when I left. She'd be 25 now, a grown woman I didn't know. I typed back, "It's real. I'm alive. I'm sorry you're caught in the middle of this." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, "Are you coming to church?" I stared at that question for a long moment. Then I made a decision. "Yes," I typed. "I'm coming." I put on my best suit, the Tom Ford in charcoal gray that made me look like money and power personified. Cameron picked me up at 10:15, and we drove to New Testament Holiness Ministry in Cascade Heights. The church was a modern building, the one my father had gone into debt to construct, all glass and steel and contemporary architecture. Cars filled the parking lot: Mercedes, BMWs, Cadillacs, the vehicles of Atlanta's aspirational black middle class. We sat in the parking lot, and I watched people file in, families in their Sunday best, deacons in white gloves, ushers in their uniforms. "Last chance to change your mind," Cameron said. "We can leave right now. We can handle this with lawyers and documents." "No," I said. "I need to see this through." We walked in at 10:58, 2 minutes before service started. The sanctuary was beautiful, with soaring ceilings and state-of-the-art sound. The choir was assembled, the musicians warming up. The congregation was finding their seats, about 300 people in a space built for 500. I saw the decline my father hadn't wanted to admit. We sat in the back row, and immediately people started noticing us. I could see the whispers spreading, people pulling out their phones, the rustle of recognition moving through the crowd like wind through wheat. Mrs. Patterson was there, 5 rows up, and when she saw me she stood up and pointed, her voice carrying, "That's him. That's Marcus Washington. He's alive." The sanctuary went silent. Every head turned. Every eye found me. And then my father walked out onto the platform. Reverend Augustus Washington looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His suit was immaculate as always, but his face was drawn, his eyes were red, and his hands shook slightly as he gripped the pulpit. He saw me immediately. Our eyes locked across the sanctuary, and I saw him make his choice in real time. He gestured to the choir director to wait, stepped up to the microphone, and spoke. "Brothers and sisters," he said, his voice cracking, "before we begin worship today, I have a confession to make." The congregation leaned forward. You could hear a pin drop. 12 years ago, my father continued, his hands gripping the pulpit until his knuckles went white, "I told you that my son Marcus had died. We held a memorial service. We mourned together. You supported my family through what I told you was the darkest time of our lives." He paused, and I could see him fighting for composure. "I lied to you," he said, and gasps rippled through the sanctuary. "Marcus didn't die. He left home to pursue a different path than the one I wanted for him, and I was so angry, so ashamed, so prideful that I told everyone he was dead. I chose my reputation over my son. I chose the appearance of a perfect family over the reality of a complicated one." The congregation erupted. People were standing, shouting, some in anger, some in shock. My mother sat in the front row, her head down, crying into her hands. "He's here," my father said, pointing to the back row. "Marcus is here, alive, successful, and a better man than I gave him credit for. And I need to publicly apologize to him and to all of you for the lie I've lived for 12 years. The sanctuary spun toward me. 300 faces, 300 people processing the resurrection happening in front of them. I stood up slowly. I didn't walk to the front, didn't make a speech, didn't offer reconciliation or forgiveness in that moment. I just stood there and let them see me, let them witness the truth. Then I turned and walked out of the sanctuary, Cameron beside me. Behind me, I could hear the chaos erupting, questions being shouted, my father's voice trying to maintain control, failing. We got in the car and drove away. "He did it," Cameron said, sounding almost surprised. "He actually told the truth. He didn't have a choice," I said. "When you corner a desperate man, he'll do anything to survive." 6 months later, I'm sitting in my office in downtown Atlanta, looking out over the city I left and came back to conquer. New Testament Holiness Ministry is now officially owned by the Washington Foundation, a nonprofit I established that provides technology training and business development resources to underserved communities. My father still serves as senior pastor, but the church is no longer his empire. It's a community asset. My parents live in a modest condo in College Park that the foundation owns. They drive 10-year-old cars. They live on my father's pension and Social Security. They are alive, functional, but the Washington family dynasty is over. My mother calls once a week. I don't always answer, but sometimes I do. Our conversations are stilted, careful, the slow process of two strangers trying to find common ground. My father and I have spoken 3 times in 6 months. Each conversation is brief, formal, the relationship of acquaintances rather than father and son. But Big Mama Eleanor's photograph sits on my desk in a silver frame. And last month, I hired my sister Alicia as Director of Community Outreach for the foundation. She's brilliant, compassionate, and we're slowly building a relationship we never had. People tell me I was cruel for what I did. They say family should forgive, that I should have been the bigger person, that my success should have been enough without needing to humble my parents publicly. But forgiveness without accountability is just enabling. And I didn't destroy them, I gave them a choice between truth and consequences. They chose truth, finally, after 12 years of lies. I take a sip of coffee and look at my calendar. Today I'm meeting with a group of young entrepreneurs from historically black colleges. Kids who remind me of who I was at 21, hungry, brilliant, and terrified they'll never get a shot. I'm going to fund 10 of them, give them the capital and mentorship I had to fight for alone. The door to my office opens, and Cameron walks in with his tablet and his morning briefing. "Big day," he says. "The Washington Foundation is officially launching in 3 cities this month. We're going to change a lot of lives, Marcus." "That's the plan," I say. As I stand up to head to the conference room, I catch my reflection in the window. I'm not that scared kid sleeping in a storage unit anymore. I'm not the son who was erased and mourned while still breathing. I'm Marcus Terrell Washington, alive, present, and building a legacy that can't be stolen or denied. They tried to bury me, but they forgot something important. I was built to survive, to rise, to resurrect myself from any grave they dug. And now I'm planting gardens where they tried to put tombstones. Thank you for watching all the way through. There's another story to your left screen. You'll enjoy it more than this one.